Rinkitink in Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 16, narrated by Melissa. Rinkitink in Oz, by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 16, Nikobob refuses a crown. Almost the first persons that Zella saw when she landed from the silver-lined boat at Regos were her father and mother. Nikobob and his wife had been greatly worried when their little daughter failed to return from Coregos, so they had set out to discover what had become of her. When they reached the city of Regos that very morning, they were astonished to hear news of all the strange events that had taken place. Still, they found comfort when told that Zella had been seen in the boat of Prince Inga, which had gone to the north. Then, while they wondered what this could mean, the silver-lined boat appeared again, with their daughter in it, and they ran down to the shore to give her a welcome and many joyful kisses. Inga invited the good people to the palace of King Ghost, where he conferred with them, as well as with Rinkitink and Bilbil.
"Now that the king and queen of Regos and Coregos have run away,"
he said,
"there is no one to rule these islands. So it is my duty to appoint a new ruler, and as Nikobob, Zella's father, is an honest and worthy man, I shall make him the king of the Twin Islands."
"Me?"
cried Nikobob, astounded by this speech.
"I beg your highness, on my bended knees, not to do so cruel a thing as to make me king."
"Why not?"
inquired Rinkitink.
"I'm a king, and I know how it feels. I assure you, good Nikobob, that I quite enjoy my high rank, although a jeweled crown is rather heavy to wear in hot weather."
"With you, noble sir, it is different,"
said Nikobob.
"for you are far from your kingdom and its trials and worries, and may do as you please. But to remain in Regos as king over these fierce and unruly warriors would be to live in constant anxiety and peril, and the chances are that they would murder me within a month. As I have done no harm to anyone, and have tried to be a good and upright man, I do not think that I should be condemned to such a dreadful fate."
"Very well,"
replied Inga.
"we will say no more about your being king. I merely wanted to make you rich and prosperous, as I had promised Zella."
"Please forget that promise,"
pleaded the charcoal burner earnestly.
"I have been safe from molestation for many years, because I was poor, and possessed nothing that anyone else could envy. But if you make me rich and prosperous, I shall at once become the prey of thieves and marauders, and probably will lose my life in the attempt to protect my fortune."
Inga looked at the man in surprise.
"What then can I do to please you?"
he inquired.
"Nothing more than to allow me to go home to my poor cabin,"
said Nikobob.
"Perhaps,"
remarked King Rinkitink,
"the charcoal burner has more wisdom concealed in that hard head of his than we gave him credit for. But let us use that wisdom for the present to counsel us what to do in this emergency."
"What you call my wisdom,"
said Nikobob,
"is merely common sense. I have noticed that some men become rich and are scorned by some and robbed by others. Other men become famous and are mocked at and derided by their fellows. But the poor and humble man who lives unnoticed and unknown escapes all these troubles and is the only one who can appreciate the joy of living."
"If I had a hand instead of a cloven hoof, I'd like to shake hands with you, Nikobob,"
said Bilbil the goat.
"but the poor man must not have a cruel master, or he is undone."
During the council they found, indeed, that the advice of the charcoal burner was both shrewd and sensible, and they profited much by his words. Inga gave Captain Buzzub the command of the warriors, and made him promise to keep his men quiet and orderly, if he could. Then the boy allowed all of King Goss's former slaves, except those who came from Pingaree, to choose what boats they required, and to stock them with provisions, and row away to their own countries. When these had departed, with grateful thanks and many blessings showered upon the boy prince who had set them free, Inga made preparations to send his own people home, where they were told to rebuild their houses and then erect a new royal palace. They were then to await patiently the coming of King Kitticut or Prince Inga.
My greatest worry,
said the boy to his friends,
is to know whom to appoint to take charge of this work, of restoring Pingaree to its former condition. My men are all pearl fishers, and although willing and honest, have no talent for directing others how to work.
While the preparations for departure were being made, Nikobob offered to direct the men of Pingaree, and did so in a very capable manner. As the island had been despoiled of all its valuable furniture and draperies, and rich cloths, and paintings, and statuary, and the like, as well as gold and silver and ornaments, Inga thought it no more than just that they be replaced by the spoilers. So he directed his people to search through the storehouses of King Goss, and to regain all their goods and chattels that could be found. Also he instructed them to take as much else as they required to make their new homes comfortable, so that many boats were loaded full of goods that would enable the people to restore Pingaree to its former state of comfort. For his father's new palace, the boy plundered the palaces of both Queen Cor and King Goss, sending enough wares away with his people to make King Kitticut's new residence as handsomely fitted and furnished as had been the one which the ruthless invaders from Regos had destroyed. It was a great fleet of boats that set out one bright, sunny morning on the voyage to Pingaree, carrying all the men, women, and children, and all the goods for refitting their homes. As he saw the fleet depart, Prince Inga felt that he had already successfully accomplished a part of his mission, but he vowed he would never return to Pingaree in person until he could take his father and mother there with him, unless, indeed, King Goss wickedly destroyed his beloved parents, in which case Inga would become king of Pingaree, and it would be his duty to go to his people and rule over them. It was while the last of the boats were preparing to sail for Pingaree that Nikobob, who had been of great service in getting them ready, came to Inga in a thoughtful mood and said,
Your Highness, my wife and my daughter Zella have been urging me to leave Regos and settle down in your island, in a new home. From what your people have told me, Pingaree is a better place to live than Regos, and there are no cruel warriors or savage beasts there to keep one in constant fear for the safety of those he loves. Therefore I have come to ask to go with my family in one of the boats.
Inga was much pleased with this proposal, and not only granted Nikobob permission to go to Pingaree to live, but instructed him to take with him sufficient goods to furnish his new home in a comfortable manner. In addition to this, he appointed Nikobob general manager of the buildings and of the pearl fisheries until his father or he himself arrived, and the people approved this order because they liked Nikobob and knew him to be just and honest. Soon as the last boat of the great flotilla had disappeared from the view of those left at Regos, Inga and Rinkitink prepared to leave the island themselves. The boy was anxious to overtake the boat of King Goss if possible, and Rinkitink had no desire to remain in Regos. Buzzub and the warriors stood silently on the shore and watched the black boat with its silver lining depart, and I am sure they were as glad to be rid of their unwelcome visitors as Inga and Rinkitink and Bilbil were to leave. The boy asked the White Pearl what direction the boat of King Goss had taken, and then he followed after it, rowing hard and steadily for 8 days without becoming at all weary. But although the black boat moved very swiftly, it failed to overtake the barge, which was rowed by Queen Cor's 40 picked oarsmen. End of chapter 16. Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 17, narrated by Melissa. Rinkitink in Oz, by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 17, The Nome King. The kingdom of the Gnomes does not border on the Nonestic Ocean, from which it is separated by the kingdom of Rinkitink and the country of the Wheelers, which is a part of the land of Ev. Rinkitink's country is separated from the country of the Gnomes by a row of high and steep mountains, from which it extends to the sea. The country of the Wheelers is a sandy waste that is open on one side to the Nonestic Ocean, and on the other side has no barrier to separate it from the Gnome country. Therefore it was on the coast of the Wheelers that King Goss landed, in a spot quite deserted by any of the curious inhabitants of that country. The Gnome country is very large in extent, and is only separated from the land of Oz, on its eastern borders, by a deadly desert that cannot be crossed by mortals, unless they are aided by the fairies or by magic. The Gnomes are a numerous and mischievous people, living in underground caverns of wide extent, connected one with another by arches and passages. The word gnome means one who knows, and these people are so called because they know where all the gold and silver and precious stones are hidden in the earth, a knowledge that no other living creatures share with them. The Gnomes are busy people, constantly digging up gold in one place and taking it to another place, where they secretly bury it, and perhaps this is the reason they alone know where to find it. The Gnomes were ruled, at the time of which I write, by a king named Kaliko. King Goss had expected to be pursued by Inga in his magic boat, so he made all the haste possible, urging his 40 rowers to their best efforts night and day. To his joy he was not overtaken, but landed on the sandy beach of the Wheelers on the morning of the 8th day. The 40 rowers were left with the boat, while Queen Cor and King Goss, with their royal prisoners, who were still chained, began the journey to the Nome King. It was not long before they passed the sands and reached the rocky country belonging to the Gnomes, but they were still a long way from the entrance to the underground caverns, in which lived the Nome King. There was a dim path, winding between stones and boulders, over which the walking was quite difficult, especially as the path led up hills that were small mountains, and then down steep and abrupt slopes, where any misstep might mean a broken leg. Therefore it was the 2nd day of their journey before they climbed halfway up a rugged mountain and found themselves at the entrance of the Nome King's caverns. On their arrival the entrance seemed free and unguarded, but Goss and Cor had been there before, and they were too wise to attempt to enter without announcing themselves, for the passage to the caves was full of traps and pitfalls. So King Goss stood and shouted, and in an instant they were surrounded by a group of crooked gnomes, who seemed to have sprung from the ground. One of these had very long ears, and was called the Long-Eared Hearer. He said,
"I heard you coming early this morning."
Another had eyes that looked in different directions at the same time, and were curiously bright and penetrating. He could look over a hill or around a corner, and was called the Lookout. Said he,
"I saw you coming yesterday."
"Then,"
said King Goss,
"perhaps King Kaliko is expecting us."
"It is true,"
replied another gnome, who wore a gold collar around his neck and carried a bunch of golden keys.
"The mighty Nome King expects you and bids you follow me to his presence."
With this he led the way into the caverns, and Goss and Cor followed, dragging their weary prisoners with them, for poor King Kitticut and his gentle queen had been obliged to carry, all through the tedious journey, the bags of gold and jewels which were to bribe the Nome King to accept them as slaves. Through several long passages the guide led them, and at last they entered a small cavern, which was beautifully decorated and set with rare jewels that flashed from every part of the wall, floor, and ceiling. This was a waiting room for visitors, And there their guide left them, while he went to inform King Kaliko of their arrival. Before long they were ushered into a great domed chamber, cut from the solid rock, and so magnificent that all of them, the King and Queen of Pingaree, and the King and Queen of Regos and Coregos, drew long breaths of astonishment, and opened their eyes as wide as they could. In an ivory throne sat a little round man, who had a pointed beard, and hair that rose to a tall curl on top of his head. He was dressed in silken robes, richly embroidered, which had large buttons of cut rubies. On his head was a diamond crown, and in his hand he held a golden sceptre, with a big jeweled ball at one end of it. This was Kaliko, the king and ruler of all the gnomes. He nodded pleasantly enough to his visitors, and said in a cheery voice,
"Well, your Majesties, what can I do for you?"
It is my desire,
answered King Goss respectfully,
to place in your care 2 prisoners, whom you now see before you. They must be carefully guarded to prevent them from escaping, for they have the cunning of foxes, and are not to be trusted. In return for the favor I am asking you to grant, I have brought your Majesty valuable presents of gold and precious gems.
He then commanded Kitticut and Garee to lay before the Nome King the bags of gold and jewels, and they obeyed, being helpless.
"Very good,"
said King Kaliko, nodding approval, for like all the gnomes he loved treasures of gold and jewels.
"But who are the prisoners you have brought here? And why do you place them in my charge instead of guarding them yourself? They seem gentle enough, I'm sure."
The prisoners,
returned King Goss,
are the King and Queen of Pingaree, a small island north of here. They are very evil people, and came to our islands of Regos and Coregos to conquer them and slay our poor people. Also, they intended to plunder us of all our riches, but by good fortune we were able to defeat and capture them. However, they have a son who is a terrible wizard, and who, by magic art, is trying to find this awful King and Queen of Pingaree, and to set them free, that they may continue their wicked deeds. Therefore, as we have no magic to defend ourselves with, we have brought the prisoners to you for safekeeping.
Your Majesty,
spoke up King Kitticut, addressing the Nome King with great indignation,
do not believe this tale, I implore you. It is all a lie.
"I know it,"
said Kaliko.
"I consider it a clever lie, though, because it is woven without a thread of truth. However, that is none of my business. The fact remains that my good friend King Goss wishes to put you in my underground caverns, so that you will be unable to escape. And why should I not please him in this little matter? Goss is a mighty king and a great warrior, while your island of Pingaree is desolated and your people scattered. In my heart, King Kitticut, I sympathize with you, but as a matter of business policy, we powerful kings must stand together and trample the weaker ones under our feet."
King Kitticut was surprised to find the King of the Gnomes so candid and so well informed, and he tried to argue that he and his gentle wife did not deserve their cruel fate, and that it would be wiser for Kaliko to side with them than with the evil King of Regos. But Kaliko only shook his head and smiled, saying,
"The fact that you are a prisoner, my poor Kitticut, is evidence that you are weaker than King Cos, and I prefer to deal with the strong. By the way," he added, turning to the King of Regos, "have these prisoners any connection with the land of Oz?"
"Why do you ask?"
said Goss.
"Because I dare not offend the Oz people,"
was the reply.
"I am very powerful, as you know, but Ozma of Oz is far more powerful than I. Therefore, if this King and Queen of Pingaree happen to be under Ozma's protection, I would have nothing to do with them."
"I assure your Majesty that the prisoners have nothing to do with the Oz people.
Goss hastened to say, and Kitticut, being questioned, admitted that this was true.
But how about that wizard you mentioned?
Asked the Nome King.
Oh, he is merely a boy, but he is very ferocious and obstinate, and he is assisted by a little fat sorcerer called Rinkitink, and a talking goat.
Oh-ho, a talking goat, do you say? That certainly sounds like magic, and it also sounds like the land of Oz, where all the animals talk,
said Kaliko, with a doubtful expression. But King Goss assured him the talking goat had never been to Oz.
As for Rinkitink, whom you call a sorcerer,
continued the Nome King,
he is a neighbor of mine, you must know. But as we are cut off from each other by high mountains beneath which a powerful river runs, I have never yet met King Rinkitink. But I have heard of him, and from all reports he is a jolly rogue, and perfectly harmless. However, in spite of your false statements and misrepresentations, I will earn the treasure you have brought me, by keeping your prisoners safe in my caverns.
Make them work,
advised Queen Cor.
They are rather delicate, and to make them work will make them suffer delightfully.
I'll do as I please about that,
said the Nome King sternly.
Be content that I agree to keep them safe.
The bargain being thus made and concluded, Kaliko first examined the gold and jewels, and then sent it away to his royal storehouse, which was well filled with like treasure. Next the captives were sent away in charge of the gnome, with the golden collar and keys, whose name was Click, and he escorted them to a small cavern, and gave them a good supper.
I shall lock your doors,
said Click,
so there is no need of you wearing those heavy chains any longer.
He therefore removed the chains, and left King Kitticut and his queen alone. This was the first time since the Northmen had carried them away from Pingaree, that the good king and queen had been alone together, and free of all bonds. And as they embraced lovingly, and mingled their tears over their sad fate, they were also grateful that they had passed from the control of the heartless King Goss into the more considerate care of King Kaliko. They were still captives, but they believed they would be happier in the underground caverns of the gnomes than in Regos and Coregos. Meantime, in the king's royal cavern, a great feast had been spread. King Goss and Queen Cor, having triumphed in their plot, were so well pleased that they held high revelry with the jolly Nome King until a late hour that night. And the next morning, having cautioned Kaliko not to release the prisoners under any consideration without their orders, the king and queen of Regos and Coregos left the caverns of the gnomes to return to the shore of the ocean where they had left their boat. End of chapter 17.
Rinkitink in Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 18, narrated by Ed Good. Rinkitink in Oz, by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 18. Inga parts with his pink pearl. The white pearl guided Inga truly in his pursuit of the boat of King Goss. But the boy had been so delayed in sending his people home to Pingaree that it was a full day after Goss and Cor landed on the shore of the Wheeler country that Inga's boat arrived at the same place. There he found the 40 rowers guarding the barge of Queen Cor, and although they would not, or could not, tell the boy where the king and queen had taken his father and mother, the white pearl advised him to follow the path to the country and the caverns of the gnomes. Rinkitink didn't like to undertake the rocky and mountainous journey, even with Bilbil to carry him, but he would not desert Inga, even though his own kingdom lay just beyond a range of mountains which could be seen towering southwest of them. So the king bravely mounted the goat, who always grumbled, but always obeyed his master, and the three set off at once for the caverns of the gnomes. They travelled just as slowly as Queen Cor and King Goss had done, so when they were about halfway, they discovered the king and queen coming back to their boat. The fact that Goss and Cor were now alone proved they had left Inga's father and mother behind them. So at the suggestion of Rinkitink, the three hid behind a high rock until the king of Regos and the queen of Coregos, who had not observed them, had passed them by. Then they continued their journey, glad they had not again been forced to fight or quarrel with their wicked enemies.
"We might have asked them, however, what they had done with your poor parents," said
Rinkitink.
"Never mind,"
answered Inga.
"I am sure the white pearl will guide us aright."
For a time they proceeded in silence, and then Rinkitink began to chuckle with laughter in the pleasant way he was wont to do before his misfortunes came upon him.
"What amuses your Majesty?"
inquired the boy.
"The thought of how surprised my dear subjects would be if they realized how near to them I am, and yet how far away. I have always wanted to visit the gnome country, which is full of mystery and magic and all sorts of adventures, but my devoted subjects forbade me to think of such a thing, fearing I would get hurt or enchanted."
"Are you afraid now that you are here?"
asked Inga.
"A little, but not much. For they say the new Nome King is not as wicked as the old king used to be. Still, we are undertaking a dangerous journey, and I think you ought to protect me by lending me one of your pearls."
Inga thought this over, and it seemed a reasonable request.
"Which pearl would you like to have?"
asked the boy.
"Well, let us see,"
returned Rinkitink.
"You may need strength to liberate your captive parents, so you must keep the blue pearl. And you will need the advice of the white pearl, so you had best keep that also. But in case we should be separated, I would have nothing to protect me from harm, so you ought to lend me the pink pearl."
"Very well,"
agreed Inga. And sitting down upon a rock, he removed his right shoe, and after withdrawing the cloth from the pointed toe, took out the pink pearl, the one which protected from any harm the person who carried it.
"Where can you put it to keep it safely?"
he asked.
"In my vest pocket,"
replied the king.
"The pocket has a flap to it, and I can pin it down in such a way that the pearl cannot get out and become lost. As for robbery, no one with evil intent can touch my person while I have the pearl."
So Inga gave Rinkitink the pink pearl, and the little king placed it in the pocket of his red and green brocaded velvet vest, pinning the flap of the pocket down tightly. They now resumed their journey, and finally reached the entrance to the Nome King's caverns. Placing the white pearl to his ear, Inga asked,
"What shall I do now?"
And the voice of the pearl replied,
"Clap your hands together 4 times and call aloud the word 'click.' Then allow yourselves to be conducted to the Nome King, who is now holding your father and mother captive."
Inga followed these instructions, and when Click appeared in answer to a summons, the boy requested an audience of the Nome King. So Click led them into the presence of King Calico, who was suffering from a severe headache due to his revelry the night before, and therefore was unusually cross and grumpy.
"I know what you've come for,"
said he before Inga could speak.
"You want to get the captives from Regos away from me, but you can't do it, so you'd best go away again."
"The captives are my father and mother, and I intend to liberate them,"
said the boy firmly. The king stared hard at Inga, wondering at his audacity. Then he turned to look at King Rinkitink and said,
"I suppose you are the king of Gilgad, which is in the kingdom of Rinkitink."
"You've guessed it the first time,"
replied Rinkitink.
"How round and fat you are!"
exclaimed Calico.
"I was just thinking how fat and round you are,"
said Rinkitink.
"Really, King Calico, we ought to be friends. We're so much alike in everything but disposition and intelligence."
Then he began to chuckle, while Calico stared hard at him, not knowing whether to accept his speech as a compliment or not. And now the gnome's eyes wandered to Bilbil, and he asked,
"Is that your talking goat?"
Bilbil met the Nome King's glowering look with a gaze equally surly and defiant, while Rinkitink answered,
"It is, your majesty."
Can he really talk?
asked Calico curiously.
"He can, but the best thing he does is to scold. Talk to his majesty, Bilbil."
But Bilbil remained silent and would not speak.
Do you always ride upon his back?
Continued Calico, questioning Rinkitink.
"Yes,"
was the answer.
"because it is difficult for a fat man to walk far, as perhaps you know from experience."
That is true,
said Calico.
Get off the goat's back and let me ride him a while to see how I like it. Perhaps I'll take him away from you to ride through my caverns.
Rinkitink chuckled softly as he heard this, but at once got off Bilbil's back and let Calico get on. The Nome King was a little awkward, but when he was firmly astride the saddle, he called in a loud voice, "Get up!" When Bilbil paid no attention to the command and refused to stir, Calico kicked his heels viciously against the goat's body. And then Bilbil made a sudden start. He ran swiftly across the great cavern until he had almost reached the opposite wall, when he stopped so abruptly that King Calico sailed over his head and bumped against the jeweled wall. He bumped so hard that the points of his crown were all mashed out of shape, and his head was driven far into the diamond-studded band of the crown, so that it covered one eye and a part of his nose. Perhaps this saved Calico's head from being cracked against the rock wall, but it was hard on the crown. Bilbil was highly pleased at the success of his feat, and Rinkitink laughed merrily at the Nome King's comical appearance. But Calico was muttering and growling as he picked himself up and struggled to pull the battered crown from his head, and it was evident that he was not in the least amused. Indeed, Inga could see that the king was very angry, and the boy knew that the incident was likely to turn Calico against the entire party. The Nome King sent Click for another crown and ordered his workmen to repair the one that was damaged. While he waited for the new crown, he sat regarding his visitors with a scowling face, and this made Inga more uneasy than ever. Finally, when the new crown was placed upon his head, King Calico said, "Follow me, strangers," and led the way to a small door at one end of the cavern. Inga and Rinkitink followed him through the doorway and found themselves standing on a balcony that overlooked an enormous domed cave, so extensive that it seemed miles to the other side of it. All around this circular cave, which was brilliantly lighted from an unknown source, were arches connected with other caverns. Calico took a gold whistle from his pocket and blew a shrill note that echoed through every part of the cave. Instantly gnomes began to pour in through the side arches in great numbers, until the immense space was packed with them as far as the eye could reach. All were armed with glittering weapons of polished silver and gold, and Inga was amazed that any king should command so great an army. They began marching and counter-marching in very orderly array, until another blast of the gold whistle sent them scurrying away as quickly as they had appeared. And as soon as the great cave was again empty, Calico returned with his visitors to his own royal chamber, where he once more seated himself upon his ivory throne.
"I have shown you,"
said he to Inga,
"a part of my bodyguard. The royal armies, of which this is only a part, are as numerous as the sands of the ocean, and live in many thousands of my underground caverns. You have come here thinking to force me to give up the captives of King Goss and Queen Kor, and I wanted to convince you that my power is too mighty for anyone to oppose. I am told that you are a wizard, and depend upon magic to aid you. But you must know that the gnomes are not mortals, and understand magic pretty well themselves. So if we are obliged to fight magic with magic, the chances are that we are 100 times more powerful than you can be. Think this over carefully, my boy, and try to realize that you are in my power. I do not believe you can force me to liberate King Kitticut and Queen Gari, and I know that you cannot coax me to do so, for I have given my promise to King Goss. Therefore, as I do not wish to hurt you, I ask you to go away peaceably and let me alone."
"Forgive me if I do not agree with you, King Calico,"
answered the boy.
"However difficult and dangerous my task may be, I cannot leave your dominions until every effort to release my parents has failed and left me completely discouraged."
"Very well,"
said the king, evidently displeased.
"I have warned you, and now if evil overtakes you it is your own fault. I've a headache today, so I cannot entertain you properly according to your rank, but Click will attend you to my guest chambers, and tomorrow I will talk with you again."
This seemed a fair and courteous way to treat one's declared enemies, so they politely expressed the wish that Calico's headache would be better, and followed their guide Click down a well-lighted passage and through several archways, until they finally reached 3 nicely furnished bedchambers, which were cut from solid gray rock and well lighted, and aired by some mysterious method known to the gnomes. The first of these rooms was given King Rinkitink, the second was Inga's, and the third was assigned to Bilbil the goat. There was a swinging rock door between the third and second rooms, and another between the second and first, which also had a door that opened upon the passage. Rinkitink's room was the largest, so it was here that an excellent dinner was spread by some of the gnome servants, who, in spite of their crooked shapes, proved to be well trained and competent.
"You are not prisoners, you know,"
said Click.
"Neither are you welcome guests, having declared your purpose to oppose our mighty king and all his hosts, but we bear you no ill will, and you are to be well fed and cared for as long as you remain in our cabins. Eat hearty, sleep tight, and pleasant dreams to you."
Saying this, he left them alone, and at once Rinkitink and Inga began to counsel together as to the best means to liberate King Kitticut and Pingaree. The White Pearl's advice was rather unsatisfactory to the boy just now, for all that the voice said in answer to his questions was, "Be patient, brave, and determined." Rinkitink suggested that they try to discover in what part of the series of underground caverns Inga's parents had been confined, as that knowledge was necessary before they could take any action. So together they started out, leaving Bilbil asleep in his room, and made their way unopposed through many corridors and caverns. In some places were great furnaces, where gold dust was being melted into bricks. In other rooms, workmen were fashioning the gold into various articles and ornaments. In one cavern, immense wheels revolved which polished precious gems, and they found many caverns used as storerooms, where treasure of every sort was piled high. Also they came to the barracks of the army and the great kitchens. There were gnomes everywhere, countless thousands of them, but none paid the slightest heed to the visitors from the earth's surface. Yet although Inga and Rinkitink walked until they were weary, they were unable to locate the place where the boy's father and mother had been confined, and when they tried to return to their own rooms, they found they had hopelessly lost themselves amid the labyrinth of passages. However, Click presently came to them, laughing at their discomfiture, and led them back to their bedchambers. Before they went to sleep, they carefully barred the door from Rinkitink's room to the corridor, but the doors that connected the 3 rooms, one with another, were left wide open. In the night, Inga was awakened by a soft grating sound that filled him with anxiety, because he could not account for it. It was dark in his room, the light having disappeared as soon as he got into bed, but he managed to feel his way to the door that led to Rinkitink's room and found it tightly closed and immovable. Then he made his way to the opposite door leading to Bilbil's room, to discover that also had been closed and fastened. The boy had a curious sensation that all of his room, the walls, floor, and ceiling, was slowly whirling as if on a pivot, and it was such an uncomfortable feeling that he got into bed again, not knowing what else to do. And as the grating noise had ceased, and the room now seemed stationary, he soon fell asleep again. When the boy wakened after many hours, he found the room again light. So he dressed himself and discovered that a small table containing a breakfast that was smoking hot, had suddenly appeared in the center of his room. He tried the 2 doors, but finding that he could not open them, he ate some breakfast, thoughtfully wondering who had locked him in and why he had been made a prisoner. Then he again went to the door which he thought led to Rinkitink's chamber, and to his surprise the latch lifted easily and the door swung open. Before him was a rude corridor, hewn in the rock and dimly lighted. It did not look inviting, so Inga closed the door, puzzled to know what had become of Rinkitink's room and the king, and went to the opposite door. Opening this, he found a solid wall of rock confronting him, which effectually prevented his escape in that direction. The boy now realized that King Calico had tricked him, and while professing to receive him as a guest, had plotted to separate him from his comrades. One way had been left, however, by which he might escape, and he decided to see where it led to. So going to the first door, he opened it, and ventured slowly into the dimly lighted corridor. When he had advanced a few steps, he heard the door of his room slam shut behind him. He ran back at once, but the door of rock fitted so closely into the wall that he found it impossible to open it again. That did not matter so much, however, for the room was a prison, and the only way of escape seemed ahead of him. Along the corridor he crept until, turning a corner, he found himself in a large domed cavern that was empty and deserted. Here also was a dim light that permitted him to see another corridor at the opposite side. So he crossed the rocky floor of the cavern and entered a second corridor. This one twisted and turned in every direction, but was not very long. So soon the boy reached a second cavern, not so large as the first. This he found vacant also, but it had another corridor leading out of it, so Inga entered that. It was straight and short, and beyond was a third cavern, which differed little from the others, except that it had a strong iron grating at one side of it. All 3 of these caverns had been roughly hewn from the rock, and it seemed they had never been put to use, as had all the other caverns of the gnomes he had visited. Standing in the third cavern, Inga saw what he thought was still another corridor at its farther side, so he walked toward it. This opening was dark, and that fact, and the solemn silence all around him, made him hesitate for a while to enter it. Upon reflection, however, he realized that unless he explored the place to the very end, he could not hope to escape from it, so he boldly entered the dark corridor and felt his way cautiously as he moved forward. Scarcely had he taken 2 paces when a crash resounded back of him, and a heavy sheet of steel closed the opening into the cavern from which he had just come. He paused a moment, but it still seemed best to proceed, and as Inga advanced in the dark, holding his hands outstretched before him to feel his way, handcuffs fell upon his wrists and locked themselves with a sharp click, and an instant later he found he was chained to a stout iron post set firmly in the rock floor. The chains were long enough to permit him to move a yard or so in any direction, and by feeling the walls he found he was in a small circular room that had no outlet except the passage by which he had entered, and that was now closed by the door of steel. This was the end of the series of caverns and corridors. It was now that the horror of his situation occurred to the boy with full force. But he resolved not to submit to his fate without a struggle, and realizing that he possessed the blue pearl, which gave him marvelous strength, he quickly broke the chains and set himself free of the handcuffs. Next he twisted the steel door from its hinges, and creeping along the short passage, found himself in the third cave. But now the dim light, which had before guided him, had vanished. Yet on peering into the gloom of the cave, he saw what appeared to be 2 round discs of flame, which cast a subdued glow over the floor and walls. By this dull glow he made out the form of an enormous man seated in the center of the cave, and he saw that the iron grating had been removed, permitting the man to enter. The giant was unclothed, and its limbs were thickly covered with coarse red hair. The round discs of flame were its 2 eyes, and when it opened its mouth to yawn, Inga saw that its jaws were wide enough to crush a dozen men between the great rows of teeth. Presently the giant looked up and perceived the boy crouching at the other side of the cavern, so he called out in a hoarse, rude voice,
"Come hither, my pretty one. We will wrestle together, you and I, and if you succeed in throwing me, I will let you pass through my cave."
The boy made no reply to the challenge. He realized he was in dire peril, and regretted that he had lent the pink pearl to King Rinkitink. But it was now too late for vain regrets, although he feared that even his great strength would avail him little against this hairy monster, for his arms were not long enough to span a fourth of the giant's huge body, while the monster's powerful limbs would be likely to crush out Inga's life before he could gain the mastery. Therefore, the prince resolved to employ other means to combat this foe, who had doubtless been placed there to bar his return. Retreating through the passage, he reached the room where he had been chained, and wrenched the iron post from its socket. It was a foot thick and 4 feet long, and being of solid iron, was so heavy that 3 ordinary men would have found it hard to lift. Returning to the cavern, the boy swung the great bar above his head, and dashed it with mighty force full at the giant. The end of the bar struck the monster upon its forehead, and with a single groan it fell full length upon the floor and lay still. When the giant fell, the glow from its eyes faded away, and all was dark. Cautiously, for Inga was not sure the giant was dead, the boy felt his way toward the opening that led to the middle cavern. The entrance was narrow and the darkness was intense. But feeling braver now, the boy stepped boldly forward. Instantly, the floor began to sink beneath him, and in great alarm he turned and made a leap that enabled him to grasp the rocky sides of the wall and regain a footing in the passage through which he had just come. Scarcely had he obtained this place of refuge when a mighty crash resounded throughout the cavern, and the sound of a rushing torrent came from far below. Inga felt in his pocket and found several matches, one of which he lighted and held before him. While it flickered, he saw that the entire floor of the cavern had fallen away, and knew that had he not instantly regained his footing in the passage, he would have plunged into the abyss that lay beneath him. By the light of another match, he saw the opening at the other side of the cave, and the thought came to him that possibly he might leap across the gulf. Of course, this could never be accomplished without the marvelous strength lent him by the blue pearl. But Inga had the feeling that one powerful spring might carry him over the chasm into safety. He could not stay where he was, that was certain, so he resolved to make the attempt. He took a long run through the first cave and the short corridor. Then, exerting all his strength, he launched himself over the black gulf of the second cave. Swiftly he flew, and although his heart stood still with fear, only a few seconds elapsed before his feet touched the ledge of the opposite passageway, and he knew he had safely accomplished the wonderful feat. Only pausing to draw one long breath of relief, Inga quickly traversed the crooked corridor that led to the last cavern of the 3. But when he came in sight of it, he paused abruptly, his eyes nearly blinded by a glare of strong light which burst upon them. Covering his face with his hands, Inga retreated behind a projecting corner of rock, and by gradually getting his eyes used to the light, he was finally able to gaze without blinking upon the strange glare that had so quickly changed the condition of the cavern. When he had passed through this vault, it had been entirely empty. Now the flat floor of rock was covered everywhere with a bed of glowing coals, which shot up little tongues of red and white flames. Indeed, the entire cave was one monster furnace, and the heat that came from it was fearful. Inga's heart sank within him as he realized the terrible obstacle placed by the cunning Nome King between him and the safety of the other caverns. There was no turning back, for it would be impossible for him again to leap over the gulf of the second cave, the corridor at this side being so crooked that he could get no run before he jumped. Neither could he leap over the glowing coals of the cavern that faced him, for it was much larger than the middle cavern. In this dilemma he feared his great strength would avail him nothing, and he bitterly reproached himself for parting with the pink pearl, which would have preserved him from injury. However, it was not in the nature of Prince Inga to despair for long, his past adventures having taught him confidence and courage, sharpened his wits, and given him the genius of invention. He sat down and thought earnestly on the means of escape from his danger, and at last a clever idea came to his mind. This is the way to get ideas: never to let adverse circumstances discourage you, but to believe there is a way out of every difficulty, which may be found by earnest thought. There were many points and projections of rock in the walls of the crooked corridor in which Inga stood, and some of these rocks had become cracked and loosened, although still clinging to their places. The boy picked out one large piece, and exerting all his strength, tore it away from the wall. He then carried it to the cavern and tossed it upon the burning coals about 10 feet away from the end of the passage. Then he returned for another fragment of rock, and wrenching it free from its place, threw it 10 feet beyond the first one, toward the opposite side of the cave. The boy continued this work until he had made a series of stepping stones reaching straight across the cavern to the dark passageway beyond, which he hoped would lead him back to safety, if not liberty. When his work had been completed, Inga did not long hesitate to take advantage of his stepping stones, for he knew his best chance of escape lay in his crossing the bed of coals before the rocks became so heated that they would burn his feet. So he leaped to the first rock, and from there began jumping from one to the other in quick succession. A withering wave of heat at once enveloped him, and for a time he feared he would suffocate before he could cross the cavern. But he held his breath to keep the hot air from his lungs, and maintained his leaps with desperate resolve. Then, before he realized it, his feet were pressing the cooler rocks of the passage beyond, and he rolled helpless upon the floor, gasping for breath. His skin was so red that it resembled the shell of a boiled lobster, but his swift motion had prevented his being burned, and his shoes had thick soles which saved his feet. After resting a few minutes, the boy felt strong enough to go on. He went to the end of the passage and found that the rock door by which he had left his room was still closed. So he returned to about the middle of the corridor and was thinking what he should do next, when suddenly the solid rock before him began to move, and an opening appeared through which shone a brilliant light. Shielding his eyes, which were somewhat dazzled, Inga sprang through the opening and found himself in one of the Nome King's inhabited caverns, where before him stood King Calico, with a broad grin upon his features, and Click, the king's chamberlain, who looked surprised, and King Rinkitink, seated astride Bilbil the goat, both of whom seemed pleased that Inga had rejoined them. End of chapter 18.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
Chapter 19, narrated by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina.
Rinkitink in Oz by L. Frank Baum.
Chapter 19, entitled Rinkitink Chuckles. We will now relate what happened to Rinkitink and Bilbil that morning, while Inga was undergoing his trying experience in escaping the fearful dangers of the 3 caverns. The King of Gilgad wakened to find the door of Inga's room fast shut and locked, but he had no trouble in opening his own door into the corridor, for it seems that the boy's room, which was the middle one, whirled around on a pivot, while the adjoining rooms occupied by Bilbil and Rinkitink remained stationary. The little king also found a breakfast magically served in his room, and while he was eating it, Click came to him and stated that His Majesty, King Calico, desired his presence in the royal cavern. So Rinkitink, having first made sure that the pink pearl was still in his vest pocket, willingly followed Click, who ran on some distance ahead. But no sooner had Rinkitink set foot in the passage than a great rock, weighing at least a ton, became dislodged and dropped from the roof directly over his head. Of course it could not harm him, protected as he was by the pink pearl, and it bounded aside and crashed upon the floor, where it was shattered by its own weight.
"How careless!"
exclaimed the little king, and waddled after Click, who seemed amazed at his escape. Presently another rock above Rinkitink plunged downward, and then another, but none touched his body. Click seemed much perplexed at these continued escapes, and certainly Kaliko was surprised when Rinkitink, safe and sound, entered the royal cavern.
"Good morning,"
said the King of Gilgad.
"Your rocks are getting loose, Kaliko, and you'd better have them glued in place before they hurt someone."
Then he began to chuckle. And Kaliko sat and frowned because he realized that the little fat king was poking fun at him.
"I asked your Majesty to come here,"
said the Nome King,
"to show you a curious skein of golden thread which my workmen have made. If it pleases you, I will make you a present of it."
With this he held out a small skein of glittering gold twine, which was really pretty and curious. Rinkitink took it in his hand, and at once the golden thread began to unwind, so swiftly that the eye could not follow its motion, and, as it unwound, it coiled itself around Rinkitink's body, at the same time weaving itself into a net, until it had enveloped the little king from head to foot and placed him in a prison of gold.
"Aha!"
cried Kaliko.
"This magic worked all right, it seems."
"Oh, did it?"
replied Rinkitink, and stepping forward he walked right through the golden net, which fell to the floor in a tangled mess. Kaliko rubbed his chin thoughtfully and stared hard at Rinkitink.
"I understand a good bit of magic,"
said he.
"But your Majesty has a sort of magic that greatly puzzles me, because it is unlike anything of the sort that I ever met with before."
"Now see here, Kaliko,"
said Rinkitink.
"if you are trying to harm me or my companions, give it up, for you will never succeed. We are harm-proof, so to speak, and you are merely wasting your time trying to injure us."
"You may be right, and I hope I am not so impolite as to argue with a guest,"
returned the Nome King.
"But you will pardon me if I am not yet satisfied that you are stronger than my famous magic. However, I beg you to believe that I bear you no ill will, King Rinkitink. But it is my duty to destroy you, if possible, because you and that insignificant boy prince have openly threatened to take away my captives, and have positively refused to go back to the earth's surface and let me alone. I'm very tender-hearted, as a matter of fact, and I like you immensely, and would enjoy having you as a friend, but—"
Here he pressed a button on the arm of his throne chair, and the section of the floor where Rinkitink stood suddenly opened and disclosed a black pit beneath, which was a part of the terrible bottomless gulf. But Rinkitink did not fall into the pit. His body remained suspended in the air until he put out his foot and stepped to the solid floor, where the opening suddenly closed again.
"I appreciate your Majesty's friendship,"
remarked Rinkitink, as calmly as if nothing had happened.
"but I am getting tired with standing. Will you kindly send for my goat, Bilbil, that I may sit upon his back to rest?"
"Indeed I will,"
promised Kaliko.
"I have not yet completed my test of your magic, and as I owe that goat a slight grudge for bumping my head and smashing my second-best crown, I will be glad to discover if the beast can also escape my delightful little sorceries."
So Click was sent to fetch Bilbil, and presently returned with the goat, which was very cross this morning because it had not slept well in the underground caverns. Rinkitink lost no time in getting upon the red velvet saddle which the goat constantly wore, for he feared the Nome King would try to destroy Bilbil, and knew that as long as his body touched that of the goat, the pink pearl would protect them both, whereas, if Bilbil stood alone, there was no magic to save him. Bilbil glared wickedly at King Kaliko, who moved uneasily in his ivory throne. Then the Nome King whispered a moment in the ear of Click, who nodded and left the room.
Please make yourselves at home here for a few minutes, while I attend to an errand,"
said the Nome King, getting up from the throne.
"I shall return pretty soon, when I hope to find you peaceful. Ha ha ha! That's a joke you can't appreciate now, but will later. Be peaceful? That's the idea. Ho ho ho! How funny!"
Then he waddled from the cavern, closing the door behind him.
"Well, why didn't you laugh when Calico laughed?"
demanded the goat when they were left alone in the cavern.
"Because he means mischief of some sort,"
replied Rinkitink.
"And will laugh after the danger is over, Bilbil. There's an old adage that says, 'He laughs best who laughs last,' and the only way to laugh last is to give the other fellow a chance. Where did that knife come from, I wonder?"
For a long, sharp knife suddenly appeared in the air near them, twisting and turning from side to side, and darting here and there in a dangerous manner, without any support whatever. Then another knife became visible, and another, until all the space in the royal cavern seemed filled with them. Their sharp points and edges darted toward Rinkitink and Bilbil perpetually, and nothing could have saved them from being cut to pieces except the protecting power of the pink pearl. As it was, not a knife touched them, and even Bilbil gave a gruff laugh at the failure of Calico's clever magic. The goat wandered here and there in the cavern, carrying Rinkitink upon his back, and neither of them paid the slightest heed to the knives, although the glitter of the hundreds of polished blades was rather trying to their eyes. Perhaps for 10 minutes the knives darted about them in bewildering fury, then they disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. Calico cautiously stuck his head through the doorway, and found the goat chewing the embroidery of his royal cloak, which he had left lying over the throne, while Rinkitink was reading his manuscript on How to be Good, and chuckling over its advice. The Nome King seemed greatly disappointed as he came in and resumed his seat on the throne. Said Rinkitink with a chuckle,
"We've really had a peaceful time, Calico, although not the peaceful time you expected. Forgive me if I indulge in a laugh. And now tell me, aren't you getting tired of trying to injure us?"
said the Nome King.
"I see now that your magic can protect you from all my arts. But is the boy Inga as well protected as your Majesty and the goat?"
"Why do you ask?"
inquired Rinkitink, uneasy at the question because he remembered he had not seen the little Prince of Pingaree that morning.
"Because," said Calico, "the boy has been undergoing trials far greater and more dangerous than any you have encountered, and it has been hundreds of years since anyone has been able to escape alive from the perils of my 3-trick caverns."
King Rinkitink was much alarmed at hearing this, for although he knew that Inga possessed the blue pearl, that would only give to him marvelous strength, and perhaps strength alone would not enable him to escape from danger. But he would not let Calico see the fear he felt for Inga's safety, so he said in a careless way,
"You're a mighty poor magician, Calico, and I'll give you my crown if Inga hasn't escaped any danger you have threatened him with."
"Your whole crown is not worth one of the valuable diamonds in my crown," answered the Nome King. "But I'll take it. Let us go at once, therefore, and see what has become of the boy prince. For if he is not destroyed by this time, I will admit he cannot be injured by any of the magic arts which I have at my command."
He left the room, accompanied by Click, who had now rejoined his master, and by Rinkitink riding upon Bilbil. After traversing several of the huge caverns, they entered one that was somewhat more bright and cheerful than the others, where the Nome King paused before a wall of rock. Then Click pressed a secret spring, and a section of the wall opened and disclosed the corridor where Prince Inga stood facing them.
"Tarts and tadpoles!" cried
Calico in surprise.
"The boy is still alive!"
End of chapter 19.
Rinkitink in Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 20. Narrated by Cy, Seattle.
Rinkitink in Oz by L. Frank Baum.
Chapter 20. Dorothy to the Rescue. One day, when Princess Dorothy of Oz was visiting Glinda the Good, who is Ozma's royal sorceress, she was looking through Glinda's great book of records, wherein is inscribed all important events that happen in every part of the world, when she came upon the record of the destruction of Pingaree, the capture of King Rinkitink and Queen Pingaree and all their people, and the curious escape of Inga, the boy prince, and of King Rinkitink and the talking goat. Turning over some of the following pages, Dorothy read how Inga had found the magic pearls, and was rowing the silver-lined boat to Regos, to try to rescue his parents. The little girl was much interested to know how well Inga succeeded, but she returned to the palace of Ozma at the Emerald City of Oz the next day, and other events made her forget the boy prince of Pingaree for a time. However, she was one day idly looking at Ozma's magic picture, which shows any scene you may wish to see, when the girl thought of Inga and commanded the magic picture to show her what the boy was doing at that moment. It was the time when Inga and Rinkitink had followed the King of Regos and the Queen of Coregos to the Nome King's country, and she saw them hiding behind the rock as Cor and Gos passed them by after having placed the King and Queen of Pingaree in the keeping of the Nome King. From that time Dorothy followed, by means of the magic picture, the adventures of Inga and his friend in the Nome King's caverns, and the danger and helplessness of the poor boy aroused the little girl's pity and indignation. So she went to Ozma and told the lovely girl ruler of Oz all about Inga and Rinkitink.
"I think Kaliko is treating them dreadfully mean,"
declared Dorothy,
"and I wish you'd let me go to the Gnome country and help them out of their troubles."
"Go, my dear, if you wish to,"
replied Ozma.
"but I think it would be best for you to take the wizard with you."
"Oh, I'm not afraid of the gnomes,"
said Dorothy,
"but I'll be glad to take the wizard for company. And may we use your magic carpet, Ozma?"
"Of course. Put the magic carpet in the red wagon and have the sawhorse take you and the wizard to the edge of the desert. While you are gone, Dorothy, I'll watch you in the magic picture, and if any danger threatens you, I'll see you are not harmed."
Dorothy thanked the ruler of Oz and kissed her good-bye, for she was determined to start at once. She found the Wizard of Oz, who was playing shoe trees in the garden, and when she told him Inga's story, he willingly agreed to accompany the little girl to the Nome King's caverns. They had both been there before, and had conquered the gnomes with ease, so they were not at all afraid. The wizard, who was a cheery little man with a bald head and a winning smile, harnessed the wooden sawhorse to the red wagon, and loaded on Ozma's magic carpet. Then he and Dorothy climbed to the seat, and the sawhorse started off and carried them swiftly through the beautiful land of Oz to the edge of the deadly desert that separated their fairyland from the Nome country. Even Dorothy and the clever wizard would not have dared cross this desert without the aid of the magic carpet, for it would have quickly destroyed them. But when the roll of carpet had been placed upon the edge of the sands, leaving just enough lying flat for them to stand upon, the carpet straightway began to unroll before them, and as they walked on it, continued to unroll until they had safely passed over the stretch of deadly desert, and were on the border of the Nome King's dominions. This journey had been accomplished in a few minutes, although such a distance would have required several days' travel had they not been walking on the magic carpet. On arriving, they at once walked toward the entrance to the caverns of the gnomes. The wizard carried a little black bag containing his tools of wizardry, while Dorothy carried over her arm a covered basket in which she had placed a dozen eggs, with which to conquer the gnomes if she had any trouble with them. Eggs may seem to you to be a queer weapon with which to fight, but the little girl well knew their value. The gnomes are immortal. That is, they do not perish as mortals do, unless they happen to come in contact with an egg. If an egg touches them, either the outer shell or the inside of the egg, the gnomes lose their charm of perpetual life, and thereafter are liable to die through accident or old age, just as all humans are. For this reason, the sight of an egg fills a gnome with terror, and he will do anything to prevent an egg from touching him, even for an instant. So when Dorothy took her basket of eggs with her, she knew that she was more powerfully armed than if she had a regiment of soldiers at her back. End of chapter 20.